on our roads. We made pretty good headway. We got a lot of rock hauled the week before last, and it was just, it was a mess. So our guys are out this morning. So we started blading and started hauling. Well, we've been hauling rock, but so hopefully we can get things straightened up and get things back where they're supposed to be.
I imagine you guys will appreciate our work. Mr. Lund's having precinct 4.
Yeah, we're hauling gravel and trying to blade some roads, and where they haul the Fort Worth manure out, they have just literally demolished the roads. They just keep hauling when it's raining.
Okay. Well, this morning we have a big task. Pray that I can do it somewhat coherently or well. I've been working with this material for a year and a half. This is the galleys of my next book. It took me longer to write this than any book because I kept saying that isn't making it clear, as if I could finally make it clear. But I do want people to recognize something that in fact is thoroughly biblical, is found by regular little markings in the perennial tradition. But we have to admit was never the mainline tradition. So I can pretty much assume that what I'm going to try to say for most of you will sound very new and very different, even though it's entirely dogmatic. It really is. But it's sort of a subtext. And to put it in one phrase, deliberately shocking, Christ is not Jesus' last name. And we've sort of used it that way. We've so lumped them together that we don't realize we're talking about two different realities. I'm not saying they don't overlap. I'm not saying they don't come together. But one reason we're facing the real impasse that Christianity is in right now in all of our denominational forms is that in the first 2,000 years after what we believe is the incarnation of God in Christ, we largely were overwhelmed by Jesus and trying to figure out who he was. Ironically, that's our gospel at today's Sunday Mass this afternoon. Who do you say that I am? But there's been not a lot of recognition of the Christ. And again, as I said, we so lumped them together and we lost the massive truth. In fact, what we lost was a basis for a universal religion, a natural religion, an inclusive religion. We ended up with an overly sentimental personal religion, which is what happens when you have Jesus without Christ. Why you can make him into a white man with blue eyes. And there's no corrective to that kind of silliness. And again, it's nobody's fault. Consciousness is unfolding. I know a lot of Christians were trained to think evolution is a bad word. In my vocabulary, it's the only thing that explains very much. That we're clearly unfolding. And the second coming of Christ is you, and the second coming of Christ is still happening. It's not one event, it's the rest of history. But because we didn't understand the Christ, we didn't know how to think that way. So I always like to put a really perfect frontispiece at the beginning of my books, something that sums it all up. This time I had 3 of them. I couldn't decide between them, so I put all 3 of them. The first one is from Karl Rahner, the German Jesuit. The only really absolute mysteries in Christianity are the self-communication of God in the depths of existence. That's the soul. That's the true self, which we call grace. And in history, which we call Christ. Second, from St. John of Damascus, 7th century. I do not worship matter He's a father of the church, if that means anything. I worship the God of matter, who became matter for my sake and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter. I will not cease from honoring that matter which works for my salvation. This was the early period of the church when we were still recovering from the utter shock of the incarnation, that the Word had become flesh. And remember, in John's prologue, in John's first chapter, the word Jesus isn't used till the 17th verse, right at the end. He doesn't say the Word became Jesus. He says the Word became flesh. Now, the Eastern church developed that much more than the Western church. And we're, for the most part, products of the Western church, where we over-localized the incarnation in the body of Jesus and then felt we could or should or needed to prove that, which is unprovable. So it put us on the defensive or the offensive, however you want to see it, from the very beginning. The third frontispiece is from, of course, our supreme master of the 20th century for many of us, Thomas Merton. He ends, I think this is sign of Jonah. No despair of ours can alter the reality of things, nor stain the joy of the cosmic dance which is always there. So I believe the word Christ is one word, it's not the only word, but it works, if you can understand it correctly, for that cosmic dance. In many ways, if any of you, and you don't need to, I'm not here to push any of my books, if you read The Divine Dance on the Trinity, this book amounts to the sequel to that. First, we had to get the shape of God right, and that God is relationship, God is communion. God is not an old white man on a throne, which it's amazing how many even educated Christians still operate as if that's true. No wonder the Christian religion is falling apart. But once we get the shape of God right, then what's the shape of this manifestation of God that entered this world? So, as I think I mentioned yesterday, we can't presume that God just got interested in God's creation 2,000 years ago and left the first 13.7 billion years empty of revelation, empty of presence, empty of love, empty of communion. That the poor Stone Age people and the Mayans and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Bushmen of Africa did not have access to God. Of course they did. God isn't playing hide and seek. But we found in our overemphasizing Jesus without understanding Christ, we created a storyline. I'm making a caricature, forgive me, but that all depends upon a supposed sin that was committed between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And that just isn't a big enough storyline for, they're now saying, when I was in college, there were 6 stars for each one of us. Now it's 6 galaxies. Did you hear that? I don't know if it's true, but I just reading books like you're reading books. 6 galaxies for each human being. You have to say, who is God? Oh, well, he certainly isn't upset because someone bit into an apple. You understand? But I understand how you have to teach the mythic stories, but most people don't know how to understand sacred texts. They really don't. It's not their fault. They just weren't made ready for it. So the Christ existed from all eternity. Now let me give you my definition of Christ. One of you rightly asked me yesterday, where did the word come from? Well, Christ is the Greek for the Hebrew word for anointed. Mesach means to pour oil on something, which is to recognize its inner soul, its inner spirituality. So an anointed anything was a sacred, but to recognize that sacredness, the ritual and number of native religions was to pour holy oil, to anoint them. The word Meshach in Hebrew became Messiah.